If you thought that being pregnant was difficult, a new study has just come out that proves you right, at least with respect to eating a balanced diet that's optimal for your gestating baby. It's been known for most of human history that a pregnant woman's diet will greatly influence the health of her child. The most obvious example is alcohol. Drinking alcohol during pregnancy can damage your child's brain and cognitive development, so the optimal amount of alcohol to consume while pregnant is 0. Don't drink alcohol at all while you're pregnant. Okay, so that's easy, but it's a little more complicated with other stuff, like folic acid. Pregnant women are recommended to have 400 micrograms of folic acid a day during the first few weeks of pregnancy, because folic acid deficiency in this early stage in development can lead to neural tube defects in spina bifida, where the spinal cord is malformed and exposed. But too much folic acid is linked with autism. This is complicated by the fact that women typically don't realize that they're pregnant in the first 3 to 4 weeks, when folic acid levels are critical. Now, a new study has identified another dietary compound that pregnant women have to be mindful of: gluten. This study used the National Health Information Registries in Denmark to examine the association between prenatal gluten exposure and the risk of the child developing type 1 diabetes. Because the researchers were using national health registries, they had a huge sample size, somewhere around 67,500 pregnancies in 63,500 women. Some women had more than one child during the study period. As to their results, the researchers said, quote, "The average gluten intake was 13.0 grams per day, ranging from less than 7 grams per day to more than 20 grams per day. The incidence of type 1 diabetes among children in the cohort was 0.37%, with a mean follow-up period of 15.6 years. Risk of type 1 diabetes in offspring increased proportionally with maternal gluten intake during pregnancy. Women with the highest gluten intake versus those with the lowest gluten intake had double the risk of type 1 diabetes development in their offspring." Unquote. An incidence rate of about 0.37% is pretty rare, but this was only if the pregnant woman consumed 7 grams of gluten or less per day, so this is on the low end of the scale. Women who ate 20 grams of gluten or more per day were putting their children at almost double the risk. So that's what the data says, but there's some caveats that we have to take into consideration. First and most obvious is that these are pretty small incidence rates. This effect isn't very strong, nor is it very widespread. Second, they didn't examine the child's diet in early life, or the breastfeeding mother's diet, so both of these are possible confounding variables that might blur any links between prenatal diet and child type 1 diabetes. Third, they didn't check for other confounding variables like pre-existing diseases. Gluten consumption is linked to celiac disease, and celiac disease is linked to a higher risk for type 1 diabetes. So if they didn't look at this kind of stuff, if they didn't take this into consideration, well, that too will blur the link. And fourth, self-reported data is notoriously inaccurate. My epidemiology undergrad teacher would make this point quite often, and she would show examples of bad epidemiology questionnaires that asked kind of unwieldy questions, like, how many servings of fruit have you consumed in the last 6 months? And how many hours of strenuous physical exercise do you do in a month? The problem with these questions is that these are all things that can be interpreted in wildly different ways. For example, what's a serving of fruit? Not everyone knows. And even for people who do know how much a serving of fruit is, not everyone is able to keep track of or is able to remember how much fruit they ate in the last 6 months. It's the same with exercise. How do you define strenuous? However you define it, the people answering the questions will undoubtedly have a different perception of what you mean by strenuous physical activity. This is why self-reported data is generally considered the lowest form of evidence. It's the same reason why the testimony of an eyewitness in a court of law is generally considered to be the weakest kind of evidence. So the conclusions of this paper aren't so simple and straightforward. You might be thinking, oh, I'll just not eat any gluten at all, and my kid will be just fine. Well, not necessarily, because if you avoid all foods with gluten, well, you'll also be cutting out foods that are also rich in iron and B vitamins like B12 and B6. Deficiencies in these nutrients aren't good for your gestating baby either, so you really have to learn to balance your diet. And eating a balanced diet is hard, and being pregnant is hard. So eating a balanced diet while being pregnant is really hard. When it comes to diet, I try to blend my understanding of modern diet science with what our ancestors ate as we evolved. This means that you generally want to eat cruciferous vegetables for minerals and fiber. You want to eat real fruits for the natural sugars, and you want to eat real meat for the protein and the fat. You should eat more fruits and vegetables than meats, and you should generally avoid overly processed foods like breads and pastries. But it's really impossible for me to give you an accurate, precise percentages on what you should and shouldn't eat, because all of this varies so much from person to person. But as long as you have a reasonable, balanced diet, and you're not eating like 6 slices of bread a day, you and your gestating baby should be just fine.